Don't speak unless you're spoken to. The words landed cold, slicing through the glass-walled boardroom as every head turned just enough to notice her, just enough to dismiss her. Ava Johnson stood still beside the long polished table, a gray mop bucket at her side, the faint scent of lemon disinfectant clinging to the air like something that didn't belong. The city stretched behind them through 40-foot windows, steel and sunlight and power, but none of it touched her. To them, she was background noise. Temporary. Replaceable. Richard Coleman didn't even look at her again after that. His cufflinks caught the light as he leaned forward, voice smooth, controlled, practiced. Let's proceed. Papers shifted. Pens clicked. A quiet storm of million-dollar decisions moved across the table. Ava didn't move. Her fingers tightened slightly around the handle of the mop, knuckles pale against dark skin, but her face stayed calm. Still. Watching. Page 14. Bottom paragraph. The clause was buried like a splinter under polished language. Clean, intentional, dangerous. Her eyes traced it once. Twice. The room faded. Voices blurred into a dull hum, like distant traffic behind thick glass. She had seen something like this before. Years ago. Different building. Different suit. Same silence that followed. Same choice. Speak and be removed. Stay quiet and watch what happens. A pen hovered in Richard's hand now, inches above the signature line. Someone laughed softly at the far end of the table, a dry, approving sound. Ava lowered her gaze, just slightly, as if retreating back into her role. Invisible. Safe. Her cartwheels creaked as she turned away, the small sound swallowed instantly by the room. No one stopped her. No one asked. She walked out the side door, the soft click behind her sealing the moment like it never existed. Down the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, cold and indifferent. Ava paused beside the service station, her breath steady, her heartbeat slow, controlled. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased, worn, deliberate. A note she had written 10 minutes earlier, before anyone noticed she was listening. Before anyone cared. Her thumb hovered over her phone. One message. One decision. Back inside the boardroom, Richard's pen finally touched paper. The signature was clean. Confident. Final. Applause followed. Light. Satisfied. Expensive. The deal was done. The room relaxed. Tension dissolving into quiet celebration. No one noticed what had just been set in motion. No one noticed what had already left the room. Down the hall, Ava pressed send. Then she returned to her cart, dipped the mop into the bucket, and pushed it forward again, water rippling under the harsh white light as if nothing had changed at all. The elevator doors closed with a soft metallic sigh, sealing Ava inside a narrow box of humming fluorescent light as the building continued its quiet rhythm above her. Unaware of what had just been set in motion, the numbers blinking slowly from 47 down to 1, while her reflection stared back at her from the brushed steel wall, steady, unreadable, as if she had already accepted whatever came next. And somewhere 20 floors above, the laughter in the boardroom had begun to fade into phone calls and quick congratulations, the kind that carried confidence, the kind that assumed control. Richard Coleman standing near the window with a glass of water untouched in his hand, watching the skyline as if he owned every inch of it. His signature still drying on the final page while an assistant approached with a tablet, voice low but urgent. Sir, there is a message that just came through the internal wrist channel. And he barely turned, irritation flickering across his face because interruptions were not part of his design, not after a deal like this, not after a room had just aligned itself around his decision. Then handle it, he said, calm, dismissive, already moving on in his mind to the next acquisition, the next number, the next proof that he was always right. But the assistant did not move, fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the tablet as the seconds stretched thin. Sir, it is marked high priority. And something in the tone, something small but insistent, made Richard exhale sharply before reaching out, taking the tablet with a controlled motion, eyes scanning the screen once, then again, slower this time. The room behind him continuing its quiet chatter as his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. The message was short, precise, almost clinical in its language, referencing a liability clause, a transfer of responsibility, a risk exposure that should not have existed if the document had been clean, and yet there it was, outlined, time-stamped, undeniable, his thumb hovering over the screen as the noise in the room began to thin, one conversation at a time falling silent as people noticed the change in his posture, the stillness that replaced his usual certainty. And across the glass table someone cleared their throat, asking a question that went unanswered, because Richard was no longer looking at them. He was looking at page 14 again in his mind, the bottom paragraph he had not questioned, the line he had trusted to be routine. His reflection faint in the dark glass of the window now, less certain, less absolute. And somewhere deep in the building, Ava stepped out of the elevator into the service corridor, the air cooler, quieter, the distant echo of rolling carts and muted footsteps surrounding her as she guided her mop forward again, the water spreading in smooth arcs across the tile floor, each motion controlled, deliberate, her phone silent in her pocket now, message sent, choice made. And for a moment she paused, just long enough to hear the faint vibration of activity above, something shifting, something unraveling, before she lowered her gaze and continued working, as if the world upstairs and the floor beneath her feet had always been separate, as if silence had always been her language. And upstairs, Richard finally spoke, voice lower now, stripped of its earlier ease, pull the contract back up, and no one asked why. The contract appeared again on every screen, larger this time, sharper, no longer just a formality, but something alive, something being dissected line by line as the room shifted from celebration to calculation, the air tightening as executives leaned forward, scrolling, zooming, rereading language they had already approved minutes earlier, and Richard stood at the head of the table, shoulders squared but unmoving, his gaze locked on the same paragraph that now felt different, heavier, as if the words had changed when no one was looking. There, the assistant said quietly, pointing to the clause Ava had seen, the liability transfer hidden beneath layers of legal phrasing, subtle but absolute, and one by one the realization spread across the room, not loud, not dramatic, just a series of small reactions, a breath held too long, a chair shifting slightly, a pen tapping once and then stopping, because they all understood what it meant without needing it explained, the kind of mistake that did not announce itself until it was too late. Richard reached for the document, scrolling back, checking the timestamps, the revisions, the approvals, everything that had led to this moment. His reflection faint in the darkened screen now, no longer the man who had controlled the room minutes ago, but someone recalculating, rebalancing, trying to locate the exact point where control had slipped. Who flagged this? He asked, voice steady but lower, and the assistant hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. It came through anonymously. Sir, internal system, timestamped 11 minutes before you signed. And that detail settled into the room like weight. 11 minutes, not after, not too late, but just before. A window that had existed and been ignored. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his mind moving backward, replaying the last moments, the silence, the movement near the door, the presence he had dismissed without a second thought. And for a brief second, something unfamiliar passed through his expression, not confusion, not doubt, something closer to recognition. Pull security footage from this floor, he said, turning away from the screen, his voice regaining structure but not the certainty it once carried. And as the system loaded, the room remained still, watching, waiting, as if the answer might change what had already happened. The footage appeared grainy at first, then clearer, the boardroom from a wide angle, the table, the executives, the skyline behind them, and then her, standing near the edge of the frame, barely noticeable unless someone was looking for her, Ava Johnson, holding a mop, still, quiet, present, the kind of presence that disappears the moment you decide it does not matter. The clip rolled forward, showing her glance at the table, then at the document, her eyes pausing, focusing, absorbing, and then the moment she turned away, pushing her cart toward the door, unnoticed, unacknowledged. And Richard watched it all without speaking, the silence stretching longer this time. Deeper, because now it meant something. Now it pointed somewhere, downstairs. Ava moved the mop across the floor in slow, even strokes, the water catching the light in thin reflective lines that disappeared as quickly as they formed, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if nothing upstairs had altered her rhythm. as if the decision she had made had already been accepted long before this moment. And in the boardroom, the video froze on the frame of her leaving, the door just beginning to close behind her, Richard's voice finally cutting through the quiet again, softer now, almost measured differently. Find her. The search did not take long, not in a building where every movement left a trace, where every badge swipe, every elevator stop, every hallway camera quietly recorded the invisible patterns people believed no one noticed. And within minutes a message came through from security, concise, certain. She is on level 2, service corridor near the east wing. And Richard did not respond immediately, his hand resting against the edge of the conference table as the room watched him, waiting for direction, for certainty, for the version of him that always knew exactly what came next. But this time there was a pause, brief yet unmistakable, as if he was measuring something that had nothing to do with numbers or contracts, something quieter, more personal, before he finally straightened and walked toward the door without another word, his shoes striking the marble floor in steady, controlled steps that echoed through the hallway outside, the sound alone enough to clear his path as employees shifted aside instinctively, lowering their voices, glancing at him with curiosity they would never express, because something in his pace was different. Not rushed, not aggressive, just focused in a way that drew attention without asking for it. And 2 floors below, Ava continued her work without interruption, the mop gliding across the polished tile in slow arcs, the faint scent of cleaning solution rising into the cool air as her reflection stretched and dissolved with each pass, her movements consistent, practiced, the kind that did not change just because something else had shifted somewhere else. And when the elevator doors opened at the end of the corridor, she did not look up right away, the soft chime blending into the background hum of the building. Just another sound in a place filled with them, until the footsteps reached her, measured, deliberate, stopping a few feet away, close enough to feel the presence without needing to see it. And only then did she lift her gaze, calm, direct, meeting Richard Coleman's eyes for the first time, without the distance of glass or hierarchy between them. The silence that followed was not the same as before, not dismissive, not empty, but something heavier, something filled with recognition, as if both of them understood the moment differently now. And for a second neither of them spoke, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a flat, even glow across the corridor, flattening status, flattening difference, leaving only 2 people standing in the same space. And when Richard finally spoke, his voice had changed, not softer exactly, but stripped of the sharp edge it had carried earlier. You saw it, he said, not a question, not quite an accusation, more like a statement he needed confirmed. And Ava did not answer immediately, her hands resting lightly on the handle of the mop, water pooling quietly at the base, reflecting both of them in a distorted, wavering image, before she nodded once, small, controlled, enough to acknowledge but not expand. And Richard studied her then, not as an interruption, not as a role, but as a variable he had not accounted for, something that had existed in the room without being recognized. You sent the warning, he continued, and again she gave the slightest nod, no pride, no hesitation, just truth. And the corridor seemed to hold its breath, the distant sounds of the building fading just enough to make the moment feel isolated, contained, as if everything else had stepped back to let this unfold. And Richard exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders shifting into something else, something closer to understanding than control. Why did you not say anything in there? He asked, the question carrying more weight than the words themselves. And this time Ava did not look away, her eyes steady, her voice when it came quiet but clear. I did not think you were listening. Richard did not answer right away, and that was new. That was the part that shifted the air between them more than anything else. Because a man like him was not built on hesitation, not in rooms where decisions moved millions of dollars at a time, not in hallways where people stepped aside before he even reached them. And yet here, standing on a service corridor floor that smelled faintly of detergent and polished tile, he let the silence sit, his eyes holding hers as if he was searching for something beyond the words she had just said. And Ava did not move, her posture steady, her grip relaxed on the mop handle as the thin layer of water beneath them reflected both figures in a quiet distortion, power and stillness blending into something unrecognizable. And somewhere above them the building continued to function, phones ringing, doors opening, deals being questioned. But down here time felt slower, heavier, like it had stepped out of rhythm for a moment just to watch. You thought I was not listening, Richard repeated finally, his voice lower now, less controlled, not in volume, but in certainty, as if he was hearing the sentence for what it actually meant rather than what it sounded like. And Ava gave a small nod, not defensive, not challenging, simply factual. You told me not to speak unless I was spoken to, she said, her tone even calm. The kind of calm that does not need to prove itself. And the words landed differently now, stripped of authority, stripped of distance, echoing back to him without the weight they had carried when he first said them. And for a brief second something shifted in his expression, something subtle but undeniable, the kind of realization that does not arrive loudly but settles in slowly, reshaping everything around it, his shoulders easing just slightly, his gaze dropping for half a second toward the floor where the water traced thin lines across the tile, breaking and reforming with each small movement. And when he looked back up, the question he asked was not about the contract, not about the risk, but about her. How did you see it? He asked, and this time Ava took a breath before answering. Not because she hesitated, but because the answer was not something she had needed to explain in a long time. I used to review contracts, she said simply. Risk analysis, compliance, things like that. And Richard's eyes narrowed just enough to register the information, recalibrating, adjusting, because that detail did not fit the image he had accepted earlier, did not align with the role he had assigned her without thinking. Used to, he repeated, and Ava nodded once, her gaze drifting for a moment toward the far end of the corridor where the light dimmed slightly near the exit. My mother got sick, she said, the words quiet but grounded. I needed something steady, something that did not disappear overnight. And there was no bitterness in her voice, no explanation beyond what was necessary, just a simple truth laid out without decoration. And Richard listened, really listened. This time, the way he might have listened in a boardroom when something actually mattered, the difference now impossible to ignore, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with everything he had missed, everything he had overlooked because it had not fit into the structure he was used to. And after a moment he let out a slow breath, the kind that carries more than just air, his gaze steady again, but changed. You saved us from a serious mistake, he said, and the words were measured, deliberate, not casual, not performative, and Ava did not react the way most people might have. There was no shift in her posture, no visible acknowledgement beyond a slight lift of her chin, as if the statement was something external, something that did not alter the way she stood in that moment. And she dipped the mop back into the bucket, the water rippling outward in soft circles, her attention returning to the floor in front of her. And when she spoke again, her voice was just as calm, just as steady. I did what I could, she said, and then she moved the mop forward, continuing her work as if the conversation had simply been another passing sound in a building full of them, leaving Richard standing there for a second longer than expected, watching her, not as someone invisible, not anymore, but as someone he had almost never seen at all. Richard remained there longer than he should have, longer than anyone in his position ever did in a place like this, where time was usually measured in decisions, not pauses, his eyes following the slow, deliberate movement of Ava's hands as she guided the mop across the floor, the water catching the overhead light in thin, wavering reflections that broke apart and reformed with every pass. And for the first time that day, nothing in his world felt immediate, nothing demanded a response, no bored waiting, no voices pushing forward, just the quiet rhythm of someone working without needing recognition. And that unsettled him more than the contract ever had, because it exposed something he had not accounted for, something that had been there the entire time without asking to be seen. You walked away, he said finally, his voice no longer carrying the authority it once did, but something more grounded, more direct. And Ava did not stop what she was doing, her eyes focused on the path of the mop, ensuring the line was even, clean, complete before she answered. I finished what I came to do, she said, and the simplicity of it left no space for interpretation, no room to twist intention into something else. And Richard absorbed that, standing there with his hands at his sides, no longer commanding the space but existing within it, adjusting to it. And somewhere in the distance a phone rang, faint, persistent, a reminder that the rest of the building had not paused with him, that consequences were already unfolding upstairs, questions being asked, decisions being reconsidered. But down here none of that had reached her. None of that had changed the way she moved, the way she worked, the way she held herself, and that contrast pressed against him, forcing a comparison he could not ignore. "Come upstairs," he said after a moment, the words coming out slower than expected, less like an order and more like a request shaped by unfamiliar weight. And this time Ava stopped, not abruptly, just enough to rest the mop against the edge of the bucket, her hands folding lightly over the handle as she looked at him again, her expression unchanged, steady, and for a brief second the corridor felt narrower, the space between them more defined. "Why?" she asked, not defensive, not resistant, simply direct, and the question caught him slightly off balance because it required an answer he had not prepared, not in a language he was used to using. "Because they need to hear what you saw," he said, and even as the words left his mouth, he realized how different they sounded from anything he had said earlier, how much they relied on something he had dismissed before, and Ava considered that, her gaze holding his without shifting, without lowering, as if weighing not the request but the intent behind it, the silence stretching just long enough to make the moment feel deliberate, chosen, and then she gave a small shake of her head, almost imperceptible, but enough. They already had that chance, she said quietly, and there was no edge in her voice, no accusation, just a statement placed exactly where it belonged, and Richard felt it settle, heavier than any argument could have been, because it was true in a way that did not need to be defended, and for a second he had no response, no immediate correction, no adjustment that could reshape what had already happened, and the hallway seemed to absorb that silence, holding it between them like something fragile, before Ava reached down and lifted the mop again, returning it to the water with a soft ripple, her focus shifting back to the floor in front of her as if the conversation had reached its natural end, as if there was nothing left to resolve in words, and Richard stood there, watching her for another moment, the realization settling deeper now, not as a sharp impact but as a slow, steady understanding, before he finally nodded once, not to her but to himself, a quiet acknowledgement of something he could not undo, and then he turned, his footsteps moving back toward the elevator, each step carrying a different weight than before, leaving behind the faint scent of polished floors and the quiet presence of someone who had never needed the room to recognize her in order to matter. The elevator doors closed behind Richard with a quiet precision that felt different this time, not like an exit, but like a return to something unfinished. And as the numbers climbed back toward the upper floors, the reflection staring back at him no longer carried the same certainty it had an hour ago. His tie slightly loosened, his posture still straight, but less rigid, as if something inside had shifted just enough to change the way he occupied space. And when the doors opened again onto the executive level, the energy waiting for him was immediate, sharp, contained tension pressing in from every direction, voices lowered but urgent, assistants moving quickly between offices, the usual rhythm disrupted by something deeper, something that could not be smoothed over with a single explanation. "Sir," one of his senior analysts approached almost instantly, tablet in hand. "Legal is reviewing the clause. They are saying exposure could reach 8 figures depending on enforcement." And Richard nodded once, taking the information without reacting outwardly, but his mind was no longer racing ahead the way it usually did. It was moving differently now, slower, more deliberate, tracing cause and effect backward instead of forward. And as he stepped into the boardroom again, the room itself felt altered, not physically, but in tone. The same glass walls, the same skyline, but the atmosphere had tightened, sharpened, every person inside now aware that something had been missed, something significant, and when all eyes turned to him, expecting direction, expecting correction, he did not speak immediately. Instead, he walked to the head of the table, placing both hands lightly against the surface. The polished wood cool beneath his palms, grounding him for a moment before he looked up, meeting each gaze not as someone above them, but as someone within the same mistake. "We missed it," he said, and the words landed differently than anything he had said in that room before, because they carried no deflection, no adjustment, just acknowledgement. And the silence that followed was not confusion. It was recalibration, people shifting in their seats, absorbing not just the problem but the way it was being addressed, and one executive leaned forward slightly. "We can still contain it if we move fast," he said, and Richard nodded again, already aware, already considering. But his thoughts were not only on containment, they were on something else entirely, something that had started 2 floors below and now refused to stay there. "Before we move," he said, his voice steady but measured, "I want to understand how this was caught." And the assistant hesitated, glancing briefly at the others before answering. "It came from the internal system, anonymous submission," and Richard held that for a second, letting it sit in the open air of the room. "It was not anonymous," he said quietly, and a few heads lifted slightly, attention sharpening. "It was someone in this building who saw what we did not." And the shift was immediate, not loud, but present, because that detail changed the narrative, changed the balance. And one of the executives frowned slightly. "Who?" he asked, and Richard paused, not out of uncertainty, but out of intention, because this time the answer mattered differently. "Someone we did not listen to," he said, and the room absorbed that, the weight of it settling deeper than any number could. And outside, far below, Ava continued moving the mop across the floor, the steady rhythm unchanged, the water spreading in quiet lines that caught the light and disappeared, her presence still. Part of the building, still unseen by most, but no longer entirely unrecognized, not by him, not anymore. The room did not move right away after he said it, as if the truth had weight now, as if it needed time to settle into people who were used to moving past things quickly. And one of the senior partners leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers pressed together, studying Richard with a different kind of attention than before, not questioning authority but measuring it. "Then bring them in," he said, his tone neutral but edged with expectation, the kind that assumed correction would follow naturally, that the system would restore itself the way it always did. And for a brief second, Richard did not answer, his gaze drifting toward the glass wall where the city stretched beyond, sunlight reflecting off steel and windows in sharp, clean lines, everything outside still appearing controlled, stable, predictable, unlike the shift happening inside. And when he turned back, his expression had changed again, not uncertain, but deliberate in a way that forced the room to slow down with him. "No," he said, and the word was quiet but firm, cutting through the assumption without raising his voice. And that was enough to draw a reaction, small but immediate, a few glances exchanged, a subtle tightening of posture, because refusal was not the expected response, not in a moment where answers were being demanded. "No," someone repeated, not challenging, but needing clarity, and Richard held their attention without raising his tone. "They already did their part," he said, and this time there was no hesitation in the words, no searching for phrasing, just a clear placement of responsibility that did not shift away from the table they were sitting at, and the implication landed, not as an accusation, but as a redirection, and the room adjusted again, quieter now, more focused inward than outward, because the problem was no longer somewhere else, not in a missing report or a failed system. It was here, in the space they occupied, in the moment they had passed through without seeing what mattered. And one of the analysts cleared his throat softly, scrolling through the document again. "We need to renegotiate before this locks in," he said, grounding the conversation back into action, and Richard nodded, this time stepping fully into that direction. "Contact their legal team," he said, his voice steady, controlled again, but carrying something different beneath it, something more aware. "Tell them we are reviewing a clause discrepancy. Do not mention specifics yet." And the room moved with that, tension redirecting into motion, people reaching for phones, typing messages, pulling up contacts, the machine restarting itself. But the tone had changed, the rhythm slightly slower, more careful, as if everyone was now aware of the cost of moving too fast. And as the conversation spread across the table, Richard stepped back half a pace, his attention no longer fixed on the center of the room, but drifting again, downward, as if tracing the distance between where he stood and where he had been minutes earlier, the quiet corridor, the reflection in the water, the steady presence that had not shifted under pressure. And he let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, before turning toward the window. his reflection faint against the glass, layered over the city outside. Two images overlapping but not fully aligned. And somewhere below, Ava rinsed the mop again, the water swirling in soft circles before settling, her movements unchanged, her pace unhurried, as if the building's urgency had never touched her. And yet something had, something subtle, something that did not alter her rhythm but sat just beneath it, like a quiet awareness that what had been unseen was no longer entirely invisible, even if nothing around her had changed. And above, in a room filled with voices and movement, Richard stood still for a moment longer than necessary. The silence he had once filled now something he allowed to exist, as if learning, slowly, what it meant to actually hear it. The call with the opposing legal team stretched longer than expected, voices measured, careful, each word chosen with precision, as if the conversation itself had become a negotiation of control, and Richard stood slightly apart from the speakerphone, listening rather than leading, his gaze resting on the contract displayed across the screen, the same page 14, now marked with highlights and annotations that seemed obvious in hindsight, as if the truth had always been there waiting for someone willing to pause long enough to see it. And across the table, one of his partners leaned forward, pressing for a revision. "We need that clause removed entirely," he said, firm but diplomatic, and the response from the other end came smooth, practiced, unwilling to concede without leverage. "That clause is standard protection," the voice replied, and Richard felt the shift immediately, the familiar pattern of resistance, of pressure, of positioning, the kind of dynamic he had navigated countless times before. But this time something inside him adjusted, not in strategy, but in awareness, because he understood now how close they had come to missing it entirely, how easily confidence had replaced attention, and he stepped forward then, his voice entering the conversation not louder, but steadier. "It is not standard if it transfers unilateral liability," he said, his tone calm but exact, each word placed deliberately, and there was a pause on the line, brief but telling, before the opposing counsel responded, more cautious now. "We can review the language." And that small shift, that subtle change in tone, was enough to signal that the balance had moved, that the deal was no longer anchored solely on one side. And around the table, shoulders eased slightly, tension redistributing into focus, into controlled motion. And as the call continued, details adjusted, terms softened. Richard found himself speaking less, listening more, allowing space where he once would have filled it, and the room adapted with him. Conversations tightening, becoming more intentional, as if everyone present had become aware of the cost of assumption. And when the call finally ended, the silence that followed was different from the one before, not heavy with uncertainty, but grounded in something earned, something recalibrated. And one of the executives let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. "That was close," he said quietly, and Richard did not respond immediately. His eyes still on the screen, the clause now rewritten, the risk contained, the mistake corrected before it could fully unfold. And yet the feeling that lingered was not relief, not entirely. It was something more reflective, something that traced back not to the negotiation, but to the moment that had made it necessary. And after a few seconds he turned away from the table, walking toward the window again, the city stretching wide and distant beyond the glass, the movement below small, almost insignificant from this height. And yet he knew now that perspective could deceive, that distance could hide what mattered most. And his reflection in the glass looked different again, not because of anything visible, but because of what had shifted behind it. And without thinking, his mind returned to the corridor, to the quiet rhythm of water across tile, to the steadiness of someone who had not needed the room to validate what she already knew. And he let that thought settle, not pushing it aside, not minimizing it, just allowing it to exist alongside everything else. And somewhere below, Ava finished one section of the floor and moved to the next, her steps measured, her focus unchanged, the building continuing around her in layers she did not need to see to understand. And for a brief moment she paused, not because she was tired, but because something felt different, subtle, almost unnoticeable, like a shift in the air rather than the space. And she glanced up slightly, not toward anything specific, just acknowledging it, before returning to her work, the quiet rhythm resuming, steady as before. even as everything above had begun to change. The room began to empty slowly, not in the usual confident rhythm of a deal completed, but in a quieter, more measured way, people gathering their tablets and notes with less certainty in their movements, conversations softer, more deliberate, as if each person was recalculating not just the numbers, but their own role in what had almost been overlooked. And Richard remained at the table even as the last of them stepped out, the glass doors closing with a muted click that left him alone with the reflection of the city stretching endlessly behind him, the contract still open on the screen, the revised clause sitting there clean and corrected, a problem contained before it became something irreversible, and yet he did not feel finished, not in the way he usually did when a situation was resolved, because something about this one had not ended at the table. It had started somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere he had not been paying attention to, and he reached forward, scrolling back through the document one more time, not searching for errors this time, but retracing the path that had led him to miss it, each line now carrying a different weight, each assumption standing out more clearly in hindsight. And after a moment, he stepped back, letting his hand fall to his side, the decision forming not from urgency, but from clarity, and he turned toward the door, his pace steady as he moved through the corridor again, past offices where conversations had already shifted to the next task, past assistants who paused just long enough to register his movement before returning to their screens. The building resuming its flow around him as if nothing had happened, and yet everything felt slightly altered, like a pattern he had always followed now revealing a flaw he could not ignore. And when the elevator opened this time, he did not hesitate, stepping inside with the same controlled motion, but his reflection in the brushed steel looked different again, less guarded, less fixed, as if something had been loosened beneath the surface. And when the doors opened onto the lower level, the sound that met him was not voices or urgency, but the quiet, steady rhythm of work continuing without interruption, the faint swish of water against tile, the soft roll of wheels against the floor, and he followed that sound down the corridor until he saw her again, Ava, exactly where he had left her, her movements unchanged, her focus still on the floor in front of her, as if the entire shift above had never reached her. And for a moment he stopped a few steps away, not announcing himself, just watching, noticing the details he had missed before, the precision in the way she moved, the consistency, the lack of hesitation, and when she finished the line she was working on and lifted the mop slightly, she glanced up, meeting his eyes without surprise, without expectation, just acknowledgement, and the silence between them settled again, but this time it felt different, less like distance and more like space. And Richard took a step closer, his voice when he spoke quieter than before, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the stillness she carried. "It is fixed," he said, the words simple, direct, and Ava nodded once, her expression unchanged, as if the outcome had always been secondary to the action itself. And he stood there for a second longer, the next words forming slowly, not rehearsed, not automatic, but chosen. "I was wrong," he said, and the admission hung in the air, clear, unguarded, without explanation attached to it. And Ava did not respond immediately, her eyes steady on his, as if weighing not the words but the meaning behind them. And after a moment she gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as dismissal, but as recognition, and then she lowered her gaze again, guiding the mop forward, continuing her work as if nothing else needed to be said, leaving Richard standing there with the quiet realization that some things were not resolved with words, but with what came after them. Richard did not leave immediately after she returned to her work, and that alone felt unfamiliar, the instinct to move on, to close the moment and step back into the structure he understood, held in place by something quieter, something that did not push but did not release him either. And he watched as Ava continued the same steady motion, the mop gliding forward, the water spreading in thin reflective lines that caught the light before fading into the floor, each movement precise, consistent, unhurried, as if time itself had a different pace around her. And after a moment he spoke again, not to interrupt, but because leaving without saying it felt incomplete. "You should not be down here," he said, and the words sounded different as soon as they left his mouth, not like an order, not like correction, but like an observation that had arrived too late. And Ava paused just enough to shift her grip, resting her hands lightly on the handle before looking up at him again, her expression unchanged, steady in a way that did not need to defend itself. "This is where I am right now," she replied, and there was no resistance in her tone, no acceptance either, just a clear statement of fact that did not ask to be adjusted. And Richard held that for a second, understanding that what he had meant was not what he had said, that the space between intention and words was wider than he had realized. "That is not what I meant," he said, more carefully this time. "You have the experience, the knowledge. You should be." He stopped there, the sentence unfinished because the ending did not come as easily as it once would have, and Ava watched him, not with expectation, but with a quiet patience that made the silence feel intentional rather than empty. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, grounded in something deeper than the moment. "I have been in those rooms," she said, her gaze steady. "I know how they work." And the way she said it carried more than just information. It carried memory, distance, something that had been lived through and then stepped away from, not out of failure, but out of necessity. And Richard listened, really listened, the way he had started to, the way he had not before, and he realized that what he had assumed was absence was actually choice shaped by circumstance, something far more complex than he had allowed for. "Then come back," he said, the words quieter now, less certain, but still carrying intent, and Ava's eyes softened just slightly, not in agreement, not in refusal, but in recognition of the offer itself, and she shook her head gently, the motion small but clear. "It is not that simple," she said, and for the first time there was a hint of something beneath the calm, not frustration, not regret, just truth that did not need explanation, and Richard nodded slowly, accepting that without pushing further, understanding that some paths did not reopen just because someone finally saw them. And the corridor settled again into its quiet rhythm, the faint hum of lights overhead, the distant sound of movement elsewhere in the building, the soft swish of water against tile. And after a moment he took a step back, not out of dismissal, but out of respect for the space she held. "Thank you," he said, the words simple, direct, without embellishment, and Ava met his eyes once more, giving a small nod in return, not as acknowledgement of him, but of the moment itself. And then she returned her focus to the floor, guiding the mop forward again, the line clean, even, complete, while Richard stood there for one last second before turning away, carrying with him not just the resolution of a mistake, but the quiet weight of something he had finally learned to see. The elevator carried Richard back up again, but this time he did not watch his reflection. He watched the numbers, each floor passing with a quiet certainty that felt different from before, not because anything around him had changed, but because something in him had. And when the doors opened onto the executive level, the movement around him resumed as expected, assistants walking quickly, conversations continuing, screens lighting up with updates and revisions, the building returning to its usual pace as if the disruption had already been absorbed into its system. But he did not move immediately, standing just outside the elevator for a second longer than necessary, letting the noise pass around him without stepping into it. And then he turned, not toward the boardroom, not toward his office, but toward the long hallway lined with glass panels that overlooked the lower floors, his steps slower now, more deliberate, as if he was choosing each one instead of simply following momentum. And when he reached the railing that separated levels, he paused, resting his hand lightly against the cool metal, looking down into the distance where the service corridors connected like quiet arteries beneath the building's polished surface. And he could not see her from here, not clearly, just movement, shapes, reflections shifting under artificial light. But he knew where she was, not in position, but in presence. The steady rhythm that had not changed even when everything else had. And for a moment he stayed there, not searching, not calling, just acknowledging the space that had always existed beneath his own, a layer he had moved through without ever truly noticing. And behind him someone called his name, a senior partner, approaching with a folder in hand, voice composed. "We need your approval on the revised terms before legal finalizes." And Richard turned, the moment shifting again, but not disappearing, not the way it would have before, because this time it followed him, quiet but present. And he took the folder, scanning the document quickly, the corrections precise, the risk addressed, the structure restored. everything back in place. And yet the way he read it was different now, slower, more attentive. His eyes not just moving across the words, but through them, understanding that what mattered was not only what was written, but what could be missed if he chose not to see. And he signed, the motion controlled, deliberate, not rushed, not automatic, and handed the folder back without comment, and the partner nodded, satisfied, already turning away to move the process forward. But Richard remained still for a second longer, his gaze drifting once more toward the railing, toward the lower levels that continued their quiet work beneath the visible structure. And when he finally turned away, it was not with the same certainty he had carried earlier, but with something more grounded, something that did not rely on being the loudest voice in the room. And as he walked back toward his office, the sounds of the building settled into a new rhythm around him, familiar but altered, each step carrying the weight of a lesson that had not been taught with words, but with silence. And far below, Ava finished her shift, wringing out the mop one last time, the water dripping back into the bucket in slow, steady drops, her movements unchanged, her pace unhurried, as she placed the handle against the wall and reached for her bag. The day ending the same way it had begun, without announcement, without recognition, just a quiet completion of what needed to be done. And as she stepped toward the exit, she did not look back, because she did not need to. The work behind her already finished. The moment already passed, leaving only the faint reflection of light on a clean floor where nothing remained except what had been understood. The building grew quieter as the evening settled in, not silent, but softer, the sharp edges of the day smoothing into a steady hum of lights and distant footsteps. And on the upper floors, Richard sat alone in his office, the city beyond his window now a grid of glowing lines and moving headlights, each one part of a system that never truly stopped. His desk cleared except for a single document lying flat beneath the warm light. Not a contract this time, not a report, just a blank page he had not yet decided how to use, and his reflection in the glass behind. It looked different again, not because of anything visible, but because of what was no longer there. The urgency, the certainty that had once filled every space, replaced now with something quieter, something that did not rush to speak. And after a moment he reached for his pen, hesitating only briefly before writing a name at the top, Ava Johnson, the letters deliberate, careful, as if placing them there required more attention than anything he had signed earlier. And he sat back slightly, looking at it, not as a task, not as a correction, but as acknowledgement, the kind that did not need witnesses to exist. And across the building, far below, Ava stepped out into the cool night air, the glass doors closing softly behind her as the city greeted her with a different kind of rhythm, distant traffic, a passing breeze, the faint echo of voices that did not belong to boardrooms or contracts. Just life continuing without structure, without hierarchy. And she paused for a second on the sidewalk, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, her breath visible in the slight chill, her posture still steady, unchanged, as if the day had been like any other, as if nothing had shifted in a way that needed to be carried forward. And then she began to walk, her steps even, unhurried, blending into the flow of people moving past without noticing, without needing to, because she had never relied on being seen to know her own worth. And back upstairs, Richard stood from his desk, the chair sliding back with a soft sound as he picked up the paper, folding it once, not as a final decision, but as something he would return to, something that would not be handled the way things usually were. And he moved toward the window again, looking out over the city, the distance no longer something that separated him from what was below, but something that reminded him of it. And for a moment he allowed himself to stand there without filling the silence, without reaching for the next step, just letting the understanding settle fully, because this time he did not need to move past it. And somewhere in the reflection of the glass, layered over the lights and motion of everything beyond, there was a faint image of the man he had been that morning, standing in a room where he believed he had control of everything. And the contrast between that and who he was now was not dramatic, not loud, just present in the way he held himself, in the way he listened even when no one was speaking. And as the night deepened and the building slowly emptied, the last traces of the day faded into something quieter, something lasting. And though nothing in the world outside had changed, something inside him had. something that would remain long after the contract was forgotten. Because in the end, it was not the deal that stayed with him. It was the moment he finally understood what it meant to see someone who had been there all along.